Hey and welcome. Truthiverse is an audience-supported podcast and an audience-supported Substack as well. You can find me over there on Substack at official Brendan Murphy. And if you enjoy this work, please join the growing body of consciously evolving minds and voyage with us into forgotten and forbidden realms of knowledge. So do hit that like button, share with your fellow seekers, and if you hadn't yet, please do consider becoming a paid subscriber, whether it's over on my Substack or through buying me a coffee right here via the podcast. Also, feel free to check out my private evolutionary accelerator, Evolve Yourself, over at evolveyourself.live for the free masterclass. And of course, I do invite you to join me inside the members-only Truthiversity for all premium content, including part 2 of every podcast. See truthiversity.com for more information. Researching, writing, and podcasting is what I do full-time, so thanks in advance for your support. It does mean a lot to me. All right, welcome to this episode of Truthiverse. This week, it is my pleasure to welcome my good mate, Sam Higgins, who is the author of Visionary: Adventures in Expanded Perception, also the founder of Awaken HQ, also a mentor, a public speaker, and someone very interesting who just happened to start hearing voices back in the year 2007, which is one of many potential qualifications to make it onto this show. So, Sam, with that said, Sam is one of the most interesting people I know, and one of the most thought-provoking with the way she sees things and puts things together. So it is my pleasure to welcome you to the show, Sammy.
It's really fun to be here. So grateful you asked. Thanks.
It's a pleasure. All right, so anyone listening to this is going to be going, come on, ask her about the voices. What are you talking about? What happened? So, well, let's get the origin story here. What happened when you started hearing voices? What led to it? Just give us the Genesis story if you can.
Well, there's a few versions of the Genesis story, and the very first would be the logical one. So at that time in my life, late 20s, I was using quite a few drugs. I was not sleeping a lot, and I started hearing voices. And for quite a while, I thought I was imagining it. Like, there's people around me, there's conversations happening, people are talking about me. And I thought that was me overhearing conversations. Like, I'd be in the supermarket, hear someone calling my name, and I'd look and there's no one there. I'd be waking up and people calling or talking, and I'd be in this kind of almost liminal spaces or out of the corner of my ear. And it was eventually one day I was hearing voices talk about me in a park in Sydney, and hearing people talk about me. At least I thought they were people. And I look around and there's no one in any distance whatsoever. And I was like, holy shit, this is real. There's actually something going on. So that's that version of it. The higher order version of it would be, I guess I did my Saturn return properly. Well and truly properly. Because that voice has activated some intense psychosis, some varying delusions or very extremely hyper belief states or disconnected to reality. It was a massive personal transformation of who am I? And beyond that, there's this huge awakening of like, what the fuck is going on? Like, what is going on? Because this doesn't fit with any of the stories I was ever told. Like, I was told, and you know, this is part of what I start to share in the book, is where I went into the mental health system and they're like, you're broken, you've damaged your brain. Like, this is basically little neurons spurting extra data and it's meaningless. You know, and so it's this question of what is reality? What is consciousness? Where does this come from, and does it have meaning? So that's kind of where it began.
Yeah, beautiful. And these are like the eternal seekers' questions, right? This is the spiritual quest that it launched you on. It sounds like it launched you into, you know, the hero's journey kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure.
So okay,
so definitely a launch.
Yeah. Okay, so it you know, in some of the words I had here, you know, your words, I think shock and confusion gave way to curiosity about the nature of reality. You said you got curious about that. So can you give us a picture of the early phase of hearing voices? You know, you're just acclimating to this. You're wondering what the hell's going on. You've just figured out that I can hear voices when there's nobody else here. You know, how does it sort of develop from there?
Look, I've worked with a lot of voice hearers over the years, and it is a little different for everyone. Like, it is quite personal and unique, but I can talk about how it developed for me. So I would particularly get voices commenting on different areas of my life. So my body and how I felt about my body shame. They would be if I was in a relationship or had particular friends or high energy connections, I would hear voices that would be about them or that were really engaging how I felt about that relationship. Or if I had really big patterns. So at that time it was the drug use. I would hear voices that were around the scenarios of that, either pressuring me into more of that kind of behavior or preying on my fears around it, or urging me to get and actually take more responsibility for my life. So it was very much centered around my own fears, my trauma history. That actually came through later when I started getting into more intense. It tapped on some trauma and in family type themes. But the early days were really particularly focused on the surface level of my fears and my current life. So it's like, so that's where it was playing out.
Oh, okay, so you mentioned like the body shame thing, and certain other things there. So it sounds like most of what you heard was pretty critical. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, for sure. I've got to touch on this. Is like it was critical because that's what got attention in my system. Like my inner dialogue was critical. I had a critical mom growing up. Like it was a language form that actually reached me. So, imagine you're some form of energy or being out there. We will get to some of that later, but you're trying to connect to a person and get their attention. In those early years, you'd be trying to crack through the blocks, the resistance, the numbness, the dissociation of like the resistance to whatever else is out there. And you would go for very high value attention themes or topics. So people that have, intrusive thoughts, I would say is a comparable experience. People that are seeing flashes of things recurring sometimes can be a comparable experience. It doesn't always have to come through auditory channels. In those early years, it was super auditory. So I would hear it like a sound outside me. Now it's a lot more integrated. It's not like a sound outside me. It is more, it comes through another channel. It's still words, but it's words with shapes, feelings, sounds combined. And it is more into I suppose, I don't like the word psychic because that kind of assumes value. And there's not always that. It's more a informational channel that's evolved beyond auditory. And having said that, what I was thinking about in the early years, what else was common, I was just reflecting on it last night, is I would hear it in the pulsing of my blood. So if I increased my heart rate, I would hear things louder, or if there was white noise, like a hairdryer or a vacuum cleaner going, I would hear a lot more. Like it actually came through certain other sound phenomena, whether that's internal or external, it would actually be more predominant or easier to hear. If I was even tapping my fingers, I could hear voices with the sound, or like with the rhythm of the tap. So anything with rhythm, or that deconstructed white noise would make it easier to hear.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that reminds me of a lot of like afterlife research where they're using like white noise or they need some kind of like a background signal in order for the actual. Sorry, they need a background noise in order for the actual signal they're looking for to actually come through, which is very similar to what you just described.
Yeah, and like I wasn't seeking that, but I was seeking like these conversations or words that were coming through, the beings or energies I was connecting with, were very appealing for me. Like at that time I was quite isolated. I was looking for love and connection and meaning, and so I followed the conversations. I wasn't someone who found it easy to go, no, this is just too weird, go away. Like I was like, what is this? Who is this? Are you real? Like what's really like, and how do I know who you are? And like, so I followed that into it, and I wanted to hear more, even to my own detriment sometimes, like even to my own, and that's where the psychosis and the altered states and the lack of sleep sort of came through. But yeah, I was looking for ways to be able to connect and hear. So
it's kind of interesting. Like, what is the moment? Can you give us, I don't know, a specific example maybe of that point where your curiosity takes you just that, or took you that one step too far into, chaos?
For me, it would have been around not sleeping. So the second I would lay down at night, I could, with the peace and calm and like, I would suddenly hear a lot louder and more, have the presence to connect deeply. So I could be up all night talking to voices. And there's like, when I say voices, it sounds easy, like a separation of words to words, because we map it to communication between people. But there's emotions, there's, the shape or presence of something, or someone, like, how you can tell when someone's thinking of you, and it just, or you're thinking of someone and it feels like them, like you get a hit of their emotional beingness. Like there was beingness in there too. So there was emotional hooks, there was beingness, as well as words. Little flashes of images sometimes too. So it's this kind of and yeah, the lack of sleep for me has always been the biggest thing. Like I could go days without sleeping, and that was really not good. So I mean, in terms of hearing voices, the really big pattern research shows us the first years is often very destabilizing. There's a really rocky adjustment period. So whatever the prognosis is long term, it can really depend on the context, the treatment, how someone relates to it. But the first few years is very destabilizing. And for me, I was at uni studying a master's. I was, dating someone. I was trying to hold down temp jobs. It was quite chaotic. And yeah, so I did have psychosis for a few different, like intense periods, hospital admissions. It's a rocky couple of years.
Yeah. I mean, that sort of, it's interesting to then, it invites the question of, well, where's the boundary between, sanity and insanity? What is madness in your view? What does that look like? Well, how do you define madness or insanity with your experience?
No, I don't have one answer. Because what we also have is a situation where we're in a world context where half of what's considered normal is actually insane and untrue.
Yeah.
So disconnecting from that creates a separation that is isolating, it's disruptive, like that can be its own insanity. If I was looking for one core theme, is there's a real disconnection to self. And maybe it's your addiction into a fantasy, into another reality, into a set of beliefs being true. But you lose connection to self, and you often, as people notice, is you lose connection to the reality around you. But sometimes that reality isn't actually true either. It's just a amalgamation of accepted culture that can be crap too. So, that like the wobbliness that comes when you start to separate from the groupthink, there's a bit of that going on as piece of it. And that feels insane. Like anyone who's gone through that questioning pushback against what's considered accepted norms has experienced a variation of that. But that kind of destabilizing eventually should we would love it to land into a connected experience of self in that new framework of reality. But to be honest, most people just go find another dogmatic set of beliefs and go swallow that as their new existence and call that sanity. So
yeah. On that basis, I'd say very few people are actually sane. So as you're going through all this, you said that the first year or so is generally the most rocky. Was there a moment where, I mean, in the context of our discussion, are there any sort of low points or dark points that are kind of worth pulling on? Or my next question, if not, is basically, was there like a major, what was the turning point where you started to kind of reconcile and work with this in a way that you could kind of come to peace with it?
Yeah, look, there's a couple of really big turning points for me, and one was in 2010, and I had some intense experiences with the voices that were replaying childhood traumas, and it was quite horrific to experience, actually. And I realized at that point that where I was using drugs was too destabilizing for the experiences I was having. And so I started on the journey of getting clean and tidying up that interference with my life. At that stage, I still had doctors telling me, well, if you get clean, you'll probably stop, and then you'll stop breaking your brain, and that kind of aspect of it, which never happened. which never happened. I never stopped hearing voices, but getting clean and actually removing that intense stressor from my life was a key turning point. But in terms of making sense of the experience, because it was rocky for quite a while, 1 year. For some people, they only stay in that phase. I just want to be clear. Like, some people don't move out of that phase because they go into system that tries to medicate and suppress them, and they never come to a place of integration or empowerment around it. So, but for me, actually, I know what would be a really big turning point was when I first I started encountering more of the hearing voices movement. And their approach, which is like looking into the evidence of lived experience of hearing voices, not the medical model of it. And as you know, coming into what people actually experience is always valuable data. And I met a psychologist and teacher from the UK, Rufus May, and I was there. We were in a workshop. Long story short, I was struggling with a voice at the time, and I was sharing with some of the others in my chat group of, this voice says he's a demon and he wants to torture me for all eternity. And they're like, they're super freaked out. Like, what do we say to that? They've got no response. And they call Rufus over and he's having a chat with me. And I share my little line, and he goes, "Oh, well, that'll get your attention." And I'm like, I'm used to getting sympathy or empathy or like kind of thing. And he's like, he didn't address the content of the voice. He started to look at the why of that behavior. And anyway, so he asked me a few questions about what I was experiencing. And I'm like, well, it's, punishing me for this, and it's saying I'm terrible for that, and all this kind of stuff, which was around quite small stuff when I think back, around moving and health and keeping my space clean and focusing on like study and whatever I was doing, right? And after a while he goes, "It seems to me this voice really values order and beauty." And I'm like, what? And I can't actually communicate like the scale of shift it was for me to get out of my own victim, poor me way of looking at the situation, which was so linear in the dialogue with this voice, to have someone bring essentially what was NVC, a nonviolent communication approach, to go, what are the values that might, or needs that might be happening on the other side? And I had never thought of looking at the other side in such a way. And that's the question that actually shifted me out of my own self-centeredness, I suppose, in the experience, to go look at it from a more meta-analytical kind of level. And so that was huge.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah. So I mean, it was like sort of like you were conversing with the demon of order and cleanliness after that. But I mean, how did it then affect that particular voice and your relationship dynamic to it after you had that sort of reframe?
After I had that reframe, I started to realize that its communications were its best way of trying to talk to me about certain things. And because I'd trained my system to respond to enemy, to respond to criticism, to, like in my communication way I had approached the world, I was valuing intensity. Like, it couldn't serve connection or actually highlight those things. And to be honest, it didn't actually even care about those in the end. It wanted to build relationship. It's a being that wanted to build a relationship. And so it's like, going into someone who's not even really open or self-aware and saying, how do we build a bridge? We find things that they care about, and then we add a bit of intensity so that they pay attention, and we just focus on that. And so they'd been dialing that up, hoping it worked, without realizing how to actually, like here's the thing, we assume anything that reaches for us must have more self-awareness or less trauma or more like than us. And why the fuck would it? Like, so this is the thing of like, why would a being, just because it's of a different nature or type of existence, necessarily be better at communication than us?
Yeah, that's a great question.
It sort of really got me thinking about, am I being responsible for my half of the conversation, or building connection and relationship in a way that was mutual rather than reacting to what came in? So yeah, it shifted that, and it was a tool I brought into a lot of different voice conversations. And to be honest, I reached a point where I stopped reading a lot of what people write and share about it out there. And I just started following my own experience, because so much is littered with this paradigm of the demonic, of demons, of evil entities and things out to get us, and the projection of enemy creates it.
Yep. I think that's a
rather
huge point.
than, yeah, like this enemy image is, if you look for a bad guy, you'll find one.
Yeah.
And the story of I'm poor me, victimized by this terrible experience, like, it didn't suit me. It didn't work, and it didn't actually serve anything valuable in who I was supposed to be. So I started getting curious, and when I could get out of even some of the shock or fright or confusion of my experiences, I could start to unpick them in a different way. And that's when I would say I started connecting with voices that were able to give me higher order perspectives on what was happening.
Okay. And so for example, that voice, that particular one we were talking about, did that fade away and kind of disappear, or did it become part of a larger whole and, a larger ecology?
It evolved. It evolved into a deeper, more complex being. So there's this, one of the things that happened, you might find this interesting, in the early years, I would often try and pin identity onto different voices, like, oh, this is your name and this is your what you are. And we do this with people, right? So this is like, when I talk about unconscious communication we're doing all the time, is like, you're this and you're going to be like this and you care about this, and then we relate to our identity or perception of someone, like what we've projected on top of them, rather than the truth of what's alive. And I would often do this to a voice, and I'd try and ask them, what do you look like, and what do you, are you human or not, like all this kind of stuff. If you're human, what hair color do you have, and are you an actual person? Are you, sitting in some government office spying on me? Like, what is the deal, right? I've gone, if there's a rabbit hole or a theory, I've followed it, and I've lived inside it like it was true, and I've tested it and pushed against it for quite a bit. So the loop of that bit is I would try and lock them into identity, and they would push back. They would change their shape. They would say, I don't want to be one name. So they started it. So this first four years or so was very me trying to attach to identity, these very limited conversations. And then after I started bringing MVC into it, it started shifting again. This is where they stopped having names. I could feel and identify them by presence, not by, oh, you're so-and-so. And so it shifted into starting to be more expansive, into going off felt senses and intuitive senses, rather than the linearity of language, or the projection of an identity and expectation of, I suppose, continuity. So that voice did change. I actually still hear that one in a way, experience more than hear, probably. And he was called Harmony, and he's not called that exactly anymore. He's not called that, but he's multiple things. So yeah, it's been a long journey with that one.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I like this because we have a, as you're well aware, we have a Judeo-Christian history and context that is still, even in a secular country like Australia, our reference point and our mental models and schemas of these types of metaphysical things tend to revert or hark back to the simple, the devil versus God, and they've got angels on one side and the demons on the other side. And so it's really, I really like to hear the way that you deconstructed all of your experiences and managed to get out of those boxes and transcend all of that, because it's going to help other people to do the same thing and move past those sort of simplistic conceptual boxes that we tend to fall back on. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about it. Yeah, anything you want to add before I, keep blabbing on with my next question?
Yeah, it's okay. So I hear people talk about experiences sometimes, and they've had almost overwhelming peak states with beings coming in, or, connecting to their angels or whatever. And it's like a rush and huge heart cracking bliss and whatever. And I'm like, that's not, like, I was getting experiences that felt demonic or terrifying or scary, and it's these negative type emotions, but it's the same type of thing happening on the positive scale. Like, it's still an emotional drug. And if that bliss peak state is how they get your attention, then that's what they're doing. But it's it's almost more corruptive of free will sometimes to be overwhelmed by positivity and praise and like that kind of thing than the negative. We have usually some defenses against criticism, but overwhelming gushes of love, like we're projecting inherent goodness on something, and it's like that's actually you're just being ego stroked energetically. So this question of not assuming inherent goodness or badness of things, actually being able to work with the complexity of intention. We can have multiplicity in our layers of intention, and so can different energies we connect with. Like it doesn't have to be linear that there are good guys and bad guys. Or that can I evolve and can they? Like this other thing of assuming something's better than me, different, I found that problematic sometimes too, of like, what if sometimes I'm here teaching them about people rather than I'm here ignorant little human and some other things are going to be wiser. It's a shared reality.
Yeah, right. We're looking at it from two different sides of the reality. Like you're here on the physical side, they're in some non-physical realm. So yeah, we have something that each party has something or a perspective that the other doesn't quite have, and there's can be crosstalk and sharing of information and perspective. So it sounds like what was I going to say? It doesn't matter. It'll come back to me. But yes, there is a lot interesting here to unpack. I mean, you have obviously you've developed over time a very multi-dimensional way of looking at things. Like, for example, in the book, I remember you writing that you experience, and these aren't your exact words, but you experience auditory phenomena, different, a spectrum of auditory information, say, the same way that someone sees the color spectrum. So this kind of thing is really, yeah, let's maybe you can just talk about that for a bit.
Oh gosh, there's like two things coming to mind, and one is particularly around hearing voices can be things that are not voices. It can be things like and this is why I use the word expanded perception. It's like this space of receiving and transmitting information that's outside normal perception, and if we're close to it or we think we know what it has to be, we actually will only see that or not see that, what our expectation. So kind of opening to what that incoming is. And it is that it's not necessarily auditory in the way we understand sound. So it can be informational. It can be things like I hear music. Am I hearing it like a ringtone, like a caricature of the song? Am I hearing the actual song? Am I hearing a voice singing the song? So when someone gets a song stuck in their head, what is that? Is that actually them? Is that coming from somewhere else? Is that what's creating? Like I got super curious about this kind of stuff. It would be things like seeing patterns. So seeing patterns and messages and omens, if you want to call it that, or seeing odd things in your predictive text, or just that's another form of receiving these expanded kind of informational sets. Is it's going to come through that, where you'll notice something pop, or like it's a normal room, but like that glass pops and you don't know why, but there's a magnetism to things. And so it is complex and multi-layered. The other bit I want to touch on is that we keep focusing on 5 senses, like physical senses, and then people get super spiritual or intuitive and then they go 5 clair senses or whatever. And I think the whole model's bullshit, because we don't even have 5 physical senses. Like, we have our sense of balance, our sense of pain, our proprioception of being in a body. We have so many senses that are either interconnected or work with belief systems. So like your sense of balance is different whether your eyes are open or closed. Like you can center yourself with your eyes open versus eyes closed, and it's often different. It's how people realize they've got imbalances in their movement patterns. But we also have situations where, like your smell and taste are so connected that if you've got a blocked nose, you can't taste as well. So we don't even understand this supposed 5 sense model very well. And without trying to peg and categorize 5 expanded in clair senses, like I think it's a limit. I think there's hundreds of physical senses that overlap and interconnect with expanded senses, and there's not really any separation or delineation. So the way I see, maybe I can access 20 to 30 senses and you can access similar, but you access them differently through different belief sets, through different fusions between them, through, you've got a synesthesia of a couple where you can't explain why those things don't separate in terms of your perception, whereas for me, they're very different experiences. And so even trying to use the word auditory is problematic. What happened after a while was, and this is kind of the third phase of evolution with the voices. So the second phase was like becoming less afraid and actually starting to see beyond the images into different constructs. And the third phase was actually almost, I felt like I was getting training into receiving expanded communication. So it's where I would, they were almost cracking me out of the linearity of language. So we talk one word at a time. And some words have complexity and layeredness and meaning, but they would be talking to me, and every now and then they would send me 2 or 3 words at a time. I'd ask a question, they'd say 3 things at once. And I'd be like, whoa, I can't understand that. And they're like, yeah, you can. And it's to realize how addicted we are to language and the linearity of that being the whole communication, being the way we think, the way we make sense, the way we receive ideas. First degrees was in maths, so I do see stuff in shapes, in geometries, in patterns, in relationship and formulas of relationship, I suppose, which kind of.
Yeah, there was an interesting comment in the book, which I was going to write down, and I don't think I did, but it was something to do with what if we could see something about what if we could see something to do with connection and relationship, and your way of looking at that and the way that you put that together was something, as a way of wording it that I hadn't seen anybody else use. So yes, your way of putting reality together is a source of intrigue for sure. And I think when people get to actually work their way through the structuring of what you've written there in that book, it's going to mess with a lot of people, but in a good way, in the best way possible. You were told at one point, and I think we're going to circle back to some of this stuff and be a bit iterative with this, but I just want to go back to some of your experience with the medical system, because it still leaves a lot to be desired. And you've been in there, inside of it, you've seen and worked with people, and you were actually told to go on disability pension at one point. Don't worry about ever working again. Like you're just broken, this kind of mentality. Do you think things have shifted much since then?
Again, so this happens. It's like I hear 3 ideas at once. So it's sort of like, okay, let's put those in order. The first thing I'll say is it's a double-sided coin. I have the blessing to live in a country that does actually offer support for people in times of extreme intensity, chaos, when really the focus should be on healing, self reflection, inner growth type work. Okay, so that's actually it's not a problem. I'm not complaining that I live in a country that has that level of support for people if they need it, right? That's actually a gift, and there's definitely times where that was needed. What is the challenge is the prognosis that you can expect this essentially for the rest of your life. So that was the thing that was problematic for me is the way our mental health systems engage with risk, and not wanting to give people too positive an outlook because that's risky and might interfere with their choices right now, or that we want to protect people from entering new relationships or uni or starting new jobs when we are worried that they can't handle it, rather than engaging more proactively with skills around coping and risk management, self-awareness. We have a very protective paternalist default setting. And where most of the solution is we'll get the meds right. Like do you know what I mean? Like that's when we get your medication right. I'm like, okay, cool. So how long am I supposed to be on this? It's like, well, we'd start with about 5 years of stability and then we'd reconsider. So, you know, that's a whole rabbit hole of actually navigating that. I didn't manage 5 years, but that's a whole different tangent conversation. But in those times when you're really destabilized, mental health professionals, doctors have extreme levels of power in how we assume they're going to have answers for this. And the truth is they don't have answers. You know, it's not that there's no expertise, it's not that there's no skills, it's just that beyond I suppose extreme states where we need essentially calming and putting into a cotton wool box to protect ourselves and other people, and those states do happen for myself and others. I'm not going to avoid the reality of that extreme of mental health situations. But in terms of recovery, the conversation is getting better, but it's better than it was when I was going through it. Our systems are in a massive evolution, and systemic change takes a long time.
Yeah.
Like if you go back 100 years, I would have been basically almost locked up in a cell.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like almost dungeon type cell.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so yeah, I mean, outcomes, prognosis are changing, but the conversation around recovery, it is usually a lot slower. And having said that, the systems are in growth. They usually just feel like they're about 20 odd years behind what we know is possible.
Yeah.
I will add the level of medication use is, I've always found that fairly problematic inside the system.
The reliance
and
on
I
it.
used to the reliance on it as the thing to get right.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I've had very comparable experiences on medication and without medication. Like it wasn't, even if a medication can help you, it won't protect you from every challenging experience or symptom or situation you're in. So you still need to have the skills to navigate that. Like it doesn't save you.
Yeah.
It won't save you. Even if it's helpful, it won't save you. And I don't like the reliance on it as the long-term answer. So there was another bit in there. What I found most heartbreaking working in the system is sometimes I would help run trainings to train new staff in the health system on recovery. And I remember we'd share these studies around, you know, the recovery rate from schizophrenia. And there were so many long-term studies, 20-year plus, that showed over a 20-year time frame, at least 50% of people with schizophrenia recover fully, like clinical level recovery, not even personal recovery. I feel good, but I manage my symptoms however I manage them. Full clinical recovery. And we would give these trainings, and there's multiple long-term studies where they actually stopped studying it because it was people can recover. They stopped studying that and they started studying what helps, right? That's not the message we get through our mainstream media. It's not the message that doctors, nurses get. I remember giving a training and a nurse came up and we shared this piece that recovery is possible. Here's the evidence. Here's all the studies. And a nurse came up to me at the very end and she was crying because she said, my cousin has been diagnosed with schizophrenia and I never even knew that he could get better.
Yeah.
Like they don't know. It's not part of like the frame I would take on it is I would say it's been so co-opted by this reliance on medication as the answer that actually the conversation of recovery isn't even included as a cultural norm inside the systems, as a default setting that no, these people can all get better. And, you know, when we look at people with the belief that they can heal, they can grow, they can navigate to have exactly the life they want, they're not broken or forever wounded. There's going to be work in there around healing or, you know, trauma or learning skills they never had around relationships, coping, whatever it is. But this isn't the end.
Yeah, right. So, I liked your line, actually. You had a line there that went something like, you know, what if we thought of, you know, insanity or psychosis or whatever the word was that you used? What if we thought of it as a fever of the mind?
Yeah, for sure. And that's one of my favorite quotes is, I think I put it in the book, but the Jeanette Winters, maybe. But yeah, it's like going mad is part of a process. It's not meant to be the end result.
Exactly. That was it. Yep. And I thought that was a great quote as well.
Yeah. And to be honest, this is where like my journey through the mental health system, like I just want to, for anyone who's in that, it's to not eject unthinkingly, like be part of the conversations, but bring your power back into how you relate to them. Because it can be a helpful part for a journey and the support system for someone who doesn't necessarily have family or friends who have those, or mentors who have those skills or capacities or can teach those skills. Like, a lot of people don't come from places or contexts or families where they have the ability to help them navigate what they're experiencing. And Google search is not a good answer when you're not feeling well or dealing with a difficult experience, because often what will come up is the worst things around your fears.
Yeah.
At least that's what you'll fix it on. Like, your search engine will meet the Google search engine, and you'll find lots of very scary things. But some of it's like, you need to be able to sit with your emotions.
Mm-hmm.
You need to learn more mindfulness or self-presence, or you need to develop skills around goal setting. Some of it's not sexy. Like, and people want to chase the like big sexy healing, or suddenly I'm a psychic. It's like, mate, you also need a bit of discernment in there. Like, who are you and how do you say no before you start talking about, are you psychic, and just swallowing everything that comes in like it's automatically true.
Right, yeah. And that sort of relates into this culture we have in the, like, I guess you call it like the new age realm or whatever, where, it's kind of trendy thing to call yourself an empath, right? Like, oh, I'm so overwhelmed by everybody else's emotions and feelings constantly, I'm an empath, that sort of thinking. Whereas, maybe, it's more what some people might need to, consider what you were just saying about developing certain skill sets or coping mechanisms or different ways of relating to other humans, as opposed to, slapping this sort of fuzzy, feel good label on it and bypassing some of the work that might need doing.
Yeah. Yes. And it's so empathy and empathic communication is multi-layered. There's the physicality of what do we communicate inside our relationships, how what you're talking about, some of this cleanup around self. How worthy am I of having what I want, asking for what I need, saying no, setting boundaries. And we do have these energetic layers where we do feel other people's emotions, and there is an interference with that. And the question becomes like, when I feel emotional communications, am I entangled with that? Am I oblivious to that? Am I enmeshed in that? Like, this comes through. So one of the bits I got, and I get it from watching humans with kids when they have kids, right? And the kids come through completely enmeshed with the mum. Sometimes the dad too, but like they actually, the energy field thinks the mum's field is their field.
Yeah.
Because that's where they were, and that was truth. So enmeshment is normal. And there's this process of individuation where we learn to separate and consciously do that. Well, most people we don't consciously learn to do that. And so we live with a default setting that's somewhere between enmeshment, abandonment, hooked into our family, or if we're, adopted or had, issues growing up, whoever was around with the wounds around family. And that becomes our default setting for how we relate to the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's like hilarious. How do I turn that off? We may not be able to turn that off.
That's okay. That's funny. We interrupt this broadcast.
We interrupt this broadcast with all kinds of binging. But like, how we learn how to walk, right? Usually, how to move and walk by modeling, by positive encouragement, hopefully, and then we learn how to talk. Right? We learn how to eat and chop up food with knives and forks and read and write and all these things. And we're taught this. We're not taught, we're starting to see emotional intelligence and literacy come through, being proactively taught, understanding what an emotion is, that it's okay to cry, to sit with it, or when we're angry, how to express that without punching all the other little kids, stealing their stuff and breaking it. Like we're attempting to develop training around that. We have none around energetic selfness, or how do we relate to our energetic skills or intuition, or any of those empathic type abilities. We're not trained on it. We can look there quite logically and go, no, this is happening, but no one ever gets taught how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And we wonder why people struggle. It's like, well, this is a skill set.
Right. And yeah, very there's layers to that, as you said, because all the connections with your family, your conditioning, blah, blah, blah. And then you got to navigate the world through all of that stuff. So yeah, I found it interesting when and this comes back to some of the other stuff you've mentioned. You discovered at the heart of your voices, the different voices, you found innocence at their heart. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah. Not always. Not always.
Okay, right.
For the most part. For the most part. So okay, I'll share a story. This one is not in the book. But I was experiencing in some of the early years into that second phase, I would experience, well, think it felt like these beings that were alien would come in and operate my body. They would do stuff, and I could feel it physically. I was often quite scared. I would try to communicate that with them, and I would feel just powerless. Right. So I've read quite. I don't go into it because I don't need the drama and the stories around it. But for a while, I thought that was an alien type experience. Okay. When I was in this second phase of like stop assuming bad guys and start trying to make sense of what's happening, I had this moment, and it was on a weekend when my mum was actually having a knee surgery, and the same experience started happening, except I was my mum, and I could feel all this stuff happening around my knee. And what I started to wonder and explore, and this played out through future, experiences too, but a lot of those times had been essentially soul fragments from in a surgery, terrified, shocked, feeling power. Like, because when we go into a general anesthetic, part of us stays awake. We know that in the body and the consciousness, part of you is still awake, even though your conscious mind isn't. And that is very traumatic because you're suddenly powerless, you're being harmed. You've got people with all their faces covered up that don't speak to you, that are very cold in the feeling, very clinical, and stuff is done to you. And that's a key moment for software if you want to go, like, I suppose, a more shamanic take on it. And what I was connecting to, picking up or gathering in my body was some of these soul fragments.
Mm-hmm.
And so these experience of in or whatever happening to me was my trying to resolve the challenge of resolve the trauma of those fragments. Like, I think everything is seeking healing. I think it's seeking wholeness. And rather than going into a victim of this is bad, there's things in my body because I'm bad and I'm unclean and I need to be cleaned and purified and all this, is like, what if there is a higher order intelligence happening? What if I'm meant to have this experience? Sometimes for my benefit, but sometimes because I'm willing to offer that. Like, we're more entangled by the way we love than by the way we are afraid or terrified. And so at higher orders of self, we are love, we are service, we want to support healing. Like, why wouldn't, like, at a higher order intelligence, why wouldn't you say yes to try and resolve the trauma of another if you could? Like the soul says yes to that. It's like, right. I don't care. Like, and I don't care about your human take on it. This matters. This piece of existence is lost. And when we look at those things where we have soul fragments, and like, we're living in a reality essentially surrounded by that. Most of us are living in a body that is fragmented, and it is got lots of, whether it's cuts or gaps or fragments in, as you know, through the different energetic bodies. And it's not necessarily stuff coming from the outside. It's actually ejection from the inside, because we couldn't deal with what was going on around us. But every time I've encountered fragments like that, they'll often come in, they'll be quite because now I'm at a different level with it. Back then I didn't have a process or a meta response to what was happening. I was just almost immersed inside it and taken over within the story of it. Whereas now something comes in, I kind of know what it needs and I send it off to go get that. I don't really run it through my body or my energy system anymore. But for the most part, those soul fragments ejected because of they loved the being they were part of. Like, they were trying to save it, protect it, or take a bit of intensity that couldn't be managed and leave. So they're fueled by love. They're fueled by innocence. There's an innocence to, I'll take the bad bits and go so you'll be safe. Like that's protection. And so when you can meet something in that, and yet it's disconnected from the main being, so it's vulnerable, it's fragile, it's actually doesn't have access to higher orders of intelligence or soul, or in the same way that the wholeness of the being does, the core being. You know what I mean? Like this is it's more like a child in its level of capacity, even if it sounds snarky, or if it sounds like that's a guise of behavior, or if it sounds very aggressive. So a lot of aggressive behaviors are because it's modeling the behavior in the trauma moment. So I've seen multiple fragments where they're doing that. It's from an abuse situation, and they'll be, I need to model the energy of the abuser to actually, like that's part of the order of that package of fragment. And so it repeats it. And yet that's not what it is. It's not where it belongs in the world. And so I think of them more like children in a way, those kind of layers of energy.
Yeah, no,
they need to be taken back home. Like my soul wouldn't leave a bunch of screaming, even if they're annoying as fuck tantrum, children on like toddlers on the street. Go away, my being is sealed. Like it's like, nah, mate. Like here we'll figure out where you go. You can hang with me until we find a better place for you. And sort of that's what we're doing at these energetic layers.
What is it? I mean,
that's not the.
Yeah, no, sorry, go on.
Go. I was gonna say that's not the only thing that's out there, but it's such a big piece of our world of what's happening energetically and the debris we pick up. So
and then we interpret it as, oh my god, I'm being attacked by demons or something like this, or aliens or whatever. Actually, the comments you were making around that whole surgical theme and the shamanic aspect to it, reminds me a lot of different types of experiences that are in the literature of people describing it as, I was taken up into a craft, or I found myself on a table in a craft and there were these weird creatures there, and the menagerie of all these endless different types of beings and creatures that show up in these environments to do a surgery or to do some kind of examination or whatever. And I think your take on it is definitely useful, and again helps to challenge the simple sort of narrative, like the sort of weird astral Star Wars narrative that we've got going about good guys and bad guys, and this alien group and this faction, and it's like, well, the shamanic angle challenges that, and I think what you're saying complements that really, really well. And when you talk about you say you're hearing one of these voices and you're communicating with it, and it is one of these sort of child fragments, so to speak. And in the book you mentioned you figured out how to kind of like triage them and send them where they needed to go type thing. What does that look like? Because the way you put it a second ago made it sound a little bit like, just in passing, like you're not necessarily welcoming it back in, so to speak. But what are you actually doing? Like, just flesh that out a little bit, because it's about integration, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, if I find my energy field comes across an energy field that is vulnerable, or let's say it doesn't belong with me, like we got to think about, where does that actually belong in terms of, and this is going to come down to your cosmology and your sense of how the world works and what reality is. But I'm not going to sit here and say I have the answers, here's my answer, go follow my correct answer, because I don't think we're anywhere close to anyone having the answer. I like, give us 1,000 years thriving expandedness in pushing the edge of who we are in a new immersion of technology, like actually world speed literate communication and collaboration on ideas. Then let's see where we're at in terms of having answers. But what I'm looking at is, do you have a worldview framework that actually supports healing and wholeness and thriving, or do you have one where you're essentially victimized and powerless? And everything's out to get you? Because for me, one big step was learning to trust and build a relationship with my higher orders of self that have an intelligent design, that have an intelligent process. And I call this, like, whether we think of I don't care about how you label all the metaphysical layers if you don't have a relationship with the layers. But, eventually up there's like an infinite spark of soul or self that's connected to everything divine. And in between.
This concludes part 1 of the show. You'll find part 2 and related materials in my members-only portal, the Truthiversity, the Consciousness Raising University. This creation is the official home for all my multimedia research and entertainment content. Updated regularly, my members get access to absolutely everything I create, including full podcasts, videos, blogs, courses, audio files, live internal events, the whole enchilada. Grab yourself a free 24-hour pass at access.truthiversity.com.